All right, well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. My name is Mike Goldsworthy, and it is a gift to have you with us here today. I'm excited for you to join us as we continue on in the Divine Conspiracy Project, where many of you are reading along with us in the Divine Conspiracy. I've heard from several of you who are, from some of you who are like revisiting it, from some of you who never engaged in it before but are kind of dipping in your toes in with us. And some of you are like, holy crud, this is a lot of reading. I will probably just listen to this and maybe I will catch up on my reading at some point, which is the experience of most of my guests on here as well, who have so graciously agreed to read along with us. And then I tend to get text messages from them before we record saying, do you know how long these chapters are? So, like, what a gift. You all should know that, like, I'm sure that you know this, but that, like, folks don't get paid to be on here. They do this out of the goodness of their heart and their love for you. And so I'm excited to get to introduce you all to a friend of mine who I haven't gotten to have on here before, named Jeremy Jernigan. So, Jeremy, thanks for making some time to hang out with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me into the pod.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, for those of you, if you don't know Jeremy sits in the club with those of us who are formerly employed pastors.
It's a unique club.
It's a unique club.
We're getting t-shirts made soon.
Jeremy started an organization called Communion Wine Co. and gave himself the title of wine pastor. And so maybe that'll show up at some point as we're chatting, and then leads a podcast of his own called Cabernet and Pray, where by the end of the podcast, you have had a bit of wine. And I think you've had some good moments on there with that.
I had a chance to have you on that, and you were very fun. As I recall, one of your quotes was, "I don't know what's happening right now." I think that was a direct quote from your time on our podcast.
It was a good time. I mean, it does change the experience when you're a few glasses in by the time that you get to some stuff. And I'm not, like I told you, I've been to one of your wine experiences with Communion Wine Co., which was super interesting and like really meaningful. But like, I'm just not super, like, wine's not my area. And so I had to FaceTime you before we went on while I was in Trader Joe's asking you, like, what wine do I buy? Uh, what do I do here? I don't know. I need help.
You did
So
a great
thanks.
job.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Well, and here's the other thing about Jeremy and I. Here's another connection that we've got is that we both are adjunct professors at Hope International University, our alma mater, and so we get to have some camaraderie around what it means to be adjunct professors at a Christian college in this day and age, which is always a fun time.
It's a unique
Maybe,
experience.
yeah, that might be another podcast for another time. But today we want to talk about Dallas Willard and Divine Conspiracy. And so I'm curious for you, Jeremy. One of the things I love to ask everybody as we've been starting these is like, what's your Willard origin story? Like, how did you first come across Dallas Willard? Like, how did you first get the Divine Conspiracy in your hands? What did that look like for you?
So I grew up in the church, all the formal discipleship process. My dad has been a pastor as long as I can remember. So grew up around a lot of these things. And I just remember growing up hearing Dallas Willard all the time and hearing this book in particular quoted all the time. And then I was probably in my early 20s the first time I took it on. My guess would be, I was trying to think back when I read this the first time. I would guess it was newly out of college would be my guess, because once you get off of the assigned reading from the professors, you can start reading what you want, and then you start going through like, which books do I need to go through? As I recall, that was when I dove into this, and I do remember even then looking at the size of the book and thinking, okay, this is going to be a commitment, but everybody talks about it, and so I remember reading it and enjoying it, and I love that you're going through it in this way, because it is definitely one of those books where you're not going to catch it all in the first pass, especially, for those of us who read it years ago. It's one of those you go back to and you ponder and you explore. And it was really fun to revisit this chapter for this conversation and just remembering some of it, but also going, holy cow, there's so much there that I don't remember.
Yeah. Did Divine Conspiracy for you, For a lot of us, and I'm a little bit older than you, so it may be a bit different. And you, I think, also might have been exposed to some different experiences in the church than I was. But for me, it was such a when I read this book, it was such a shift for me of like, I would say that this was the like catalyst that opened me up to so many new places in the church and in faith than what I had known and experienced before, and really set me on a new and different trajectory. It's been interesting to go back and reread it because there's definitely stuff that I'm like, oh, I've got contention with these things now. It hits me differently now, but I also needed it as a catalyst that would open up a new door for me that would send me into a new place. I'm curious, like, was you were hearing about it a lot, so it was obviously significant for folks that were in your spheres.
Mhm.
Was it that for you as well, or do you already had a lot of that opened up to you?
So I think I read it in a season where I came out of my undergrad and kind of was on a trajectory of like, okay, I've been around this stuff my entire life, but my favorite part of undergrad was it was like a little bit of exposure to the Christian world is bigger than you think. And I think that was like if I look back on my favorite classes even, were the classes where it's like, I have never heard that thought before. And again, as someone who I grew up in the church, like I was the kid running through the pews, I that is my childhood. And so when I would get an idea that I'm like, I've never heard of that, it was really interesting. So I think I read it in that season where I was reading tons of stuff
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
I like was exponentially growing in my faith and challenging my theology. What is interesting is I have, since that time changed my theology in a number of ways. And when uh, we'll get to this, I hope, but there's a section here where I actually reading it with my eyes today, I went, oh my gosh, there's some traces of a theology that I have since come to really appreciate that I kind of think Willard's toying with here a little bit or teasing it out, but I wouldn't have even known what that was when I read it the first time. So
Yeah,
that's what's really interesting to go back and go, oh, I'm very different than when I read it. And it's hard to even pinpoint how much did this book help me get there.
yeah, is that I'm guessing it's, the way he starts hinting at open theism when he talks about prayer?
It is, yeah.
Okay,
I literally in my
yeah.
notes I wrote, was Willard a closet open theist?
Friends, we'll get into that in a minute. I don't wanna jump all the way over to that because I think there's a couple of things we wanna get to first, and so I'll have Jeremy explain open theism to you and where that, like, starts to come into play as Willard talks about prayer there, but I immediately, when I read that as well, I thought of you and was like, "Oh, I'm so glad to get to have this conversation
Oh,
with
that's
Jeremy
cool.
because."
I love that you knew exactly where I was going with that. That's pretty amazing.
It's super fun. Well, I in the way that he opens up this chapter, like he starts going through talks about the golden rule at the beginning, or what we've called the golden rule. And he writes this, he says that in kingdom life we extend the respect to others that we would naturally hope others would extend to us. This is how love behaves, and it still behaves that way when we come to our intimate relationships. There's a couple of things that are interesting to me about that. One was that, like, I appreciate he does this a few times in the chapter where he's like, we actually sometimes treat people who aren't close to us better than we treat those who are close to us, and like
Mm,
does this like helpful reframing around that. Um, but within this, I felt like this creates a bit of the context for maybe the narrative that he's weaving through this chapter in some ways of the extending respect to others. That there, I felt like there's a lot in the way that he unpacks these passages, both in how we uh, interact with other people, as well as the way that God interacts with us, that we interact with God. That's about this like mutuality of respect, of creating room for the other's autonomy and their authority over their own self, and all of that. Yeah, so I'd love to hear. Were you hearing that in the chapter? Were you seeing that kind of run through it as well?
yeah, I love that setup. I actually felt like that's something that has changed in me since reading this. That's one of the ones I went, "Oh, I wish Willard went more into this," because there's a few things that I've studied on that topic that I think are, pretty mind-boggling. One being, I've studied a little bit that historically Jesus wasn't the first one to use this idea. The thing that made Jesus unique was that he was the first one to use it in the positive sense. So you have like
Yeah.
three historical examples from pretty well-known people prior to Jesus where they said, "Hey, don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you." Right? And you can trace this back historically, multiple examples. Jesus is the first one that says, "Hey, no, actually, let's put it in a positive sense of like proactively do something," which was like, fascinating. So that was one thing I thought about, like, oh yeah, like there's that element of it that I think is really interesting. And then I thought about Stanley. I don't know if you've been familiar with how Stanley has used the golden rule, but Stanley actually talks about the platinum rule. Have you heard this?
No, who's Stanley?
Andy Stanley.
Oh, Andy.
Andy, our boy Andy.
I mean, if you'd said Andy, I would have known who you're talking about.
Oh, Stanley through you.
Yeah, I thought you were talking about Hauerwas.
Oh, okay, that's fair.
But
That's fair. So Andy Stanley talks about the platinum rule, and that's where Jesus says, as I have loved you, you therefore go love one another. And he basically says, like, the golden rule is, great, right? But the platinum rule actually supersedes that. And I agree that, hey, don't just treat people the way you want to be treated. Treat people the way Jesus has treated you, which
hmm,
obviously takes it up a notch. And so as I was getting into that, I was like, oh, that's interesting. But again, it's one of those where it's like I've read a lot on that since then that I think is really interesting. But I do obviously love what he's doing here, weaving that through kind of as a baseline.
yeah. I mean, there was something that was I think this is one of the things that was cracked open for me when I first read it was the idea of respecting the autonomy of another person and creating space for that. And he gets into that when he talks about like correction, and he says like some people have the ministry of condemnation, and which well, maybe we'll talk about that for a second, because when I read that, I was thinking about the experience of being a pastor in a church where there are people. My experience was there are people who feel like it is their job to make sure that you are doing things in the right way. They believe that they're the spiritually mature ones who need to make sure that the pastors and others in the church are doing, believing, and saying all of the correct things, that they see like that as their ministry. And yeah, did you have that kind of experience when you were leading in the church?
Oh, those are the ones that email you on Monday morning. Hey, pastor, just wanted to follow up on your sermon this weekend, and you said this, and I actually I loved what Willard does with the condemnation stuff in this chapter. In particular, the way he connects it to contempt, I think is brilliant. Like I wrote down this. He has this quote: "Contempt is a major part of condemnation in the usual case, and when we drop contempt from our soul and our bearing, condemnation rarely occurs, and never with its most devastating effects." That is some brilliant stuff. That condemnation is essentially his argument. Condemnation needs contempt, like the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
negative condemnation that we think of. And I just think he's onto something there. Of when you think about those emails you get, you think about that person who's like, "I'm going to tell you this." How much contempt is there in that? Like, I think he's onto something. And it reminded me, I just was reading a book. I just preached recently on a relationship series, and they were going through a book by John and Julie Gottman, who are like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
renowned relationship experts. And they have a term that I immediately thought of. It's one of those, like, creativity is just connecting things that are swirling in your head at the same time. So I just read the Gottman's book, then I reread this. And so my brain's like, oh, that's like the same thing, where they talk about certain kinds of negativity, if allowed to run rampant, are so lethal to a relationship that we call them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. This is kind of a famous idea that Gottmans are known for. Usually, these four horsemen clip clop into the heart of a marriage in the following order: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And so that was like fresh in my mind. And I thought, I think Willard is really onto something that we don't talk about enough in the church, of how much of the condemnation people are dealing with also is paired with contempt.
Yeah, so talk to me a little bit about like your understanding of like what is contempt, how is it showing up differently than other things that we might like anger or criticism that we might put in some similar kinds of categories. How is that sort of like showing up?
I think it's fundamentally, in my experience, it's this approach of whenever we put ourselves on a different level than the person we're talking to, and so we approach a conversation of, "Hey, I'm going to explain something to you because you don't get it." Right? Like you don't understand this the way I do. And it's almost a talking down to, it's almost like the abuse of the parental relationship, right? Like there's a healthy parent to child, and then there's like the abusive parent, like I'm just going to demean you and degrade you because I can, and you're my child. And I think some parents never grow out of that, and some people never grow out of that. Like I'm just going to talk to people with this sense of contempt. But what I think he's so onto here is that it never works. Like, we look at the reaction of the church today. I even think of like the deconstructing community. How much of it is a reaction to contempt? Like to contempt from leaders today. Hey, and I even think about, some famous quotes of, um, deconstructing is the sexy thing to do. That's a famous quote that I would say has contempt in it, right? Like,
Who said that? I don't know that
Um,
quote.
Matt Chandler. That's a famous
Oh,
Matt
okay.
Chandler quote. And, people took issue with that, like, because he was like basically saying if you're deconstructing, it's because you want to go sin. Well, that's a very insensitive way to address someone who's dealing with something, usually, in my experience, very legitimate, and they're trying to work through it. They're trying to process through it, and then you add this level of contempt. And I love something Willard says here. He says it's extremely rare that anyone who is condemned will respond by changing in the desired way, and those who can so respond are most likely to be spiritual giants already. It's like when you tell someone, "You need to calm down." Like, no one in the history of the world has ever calmed down when they were told to calm down. You're like, it doesn't work. And I think, like, literally Willard's onto something. No one ever had like a metanoia, a change of heart, repentance, because someone hit them with contempt. And yet we collectively think, no, this is, if their theology is bad enough, it warrants it.
Yeah. You know, that one of the things I've been trying to think about as I've read it this time is because I have ended up a lot of the communities in the church that I interact with now will lean on the bit more progressive leaning side, or would be at least more open and expansive in the way that they think about God and faith. And so I've always read this through the lens of like, what does this mean to me in the place that I had been in, which had often been in more conservative circles. And now I find myself in these other circles. And it's really easy for me to point back to like, okay, I can see how that was being done there. And now I'm trying to think of like, okay, in the communities that I often find myself in now, um, how is this showing up? So I'm kind of curious, as you are maybe finding yourself in some like different kinds of communities than maybe you had been in 5, 10 years ago, like, are you seeing this show up in a different kind of way there?
I think this is a way to determine a healthy community and a not healthy community. I don't think it's changing in my experience of, like, I wouldn't say like, "Oh, churches are moving away from this." I
Mhm.
think there are more churches who are choosing not to be this and are growing and are having more of a foothold. But I think in traditional evangelical circles, this is still very much a part of it. Like, I would say something, and I think you probably would relate with this, or maybe you would say something similar. It was not uncommon, when I was a lead pastor, I would often, if I knew I was preaching something that had a variety of views to it, right? Like Christians are going to disagree on this. I would often present that and say, "Hey, today we're going to look at this topic or this verse or this idea. And I'm going to share what makes the most sense to me of how I make sense out of this. I want you to understand you're welcome to disagree with me. And there would be Christians all around the world and Christians throughout history who have disagreed with what I'm about to share with you today. And you can find those arguments as well. But today I'm going to share with you what makes the most sense with me. But you're totally willing and able, to disagree with the pastor." And I always felt like that was, like, just the only way to be intellectually honest of, I'm presenting something, but I know there's another viewpoint of this. What surprised me was that was not well received in my community. That was not like, oh, thank you, Pastor, for acknowledging that there are other ways to see it. Or, I literally had people like, please stop doing that. We don't like when you do that. And I always thought that was such a weird, like, what is that? You know what I mean? Like, did you ever have something similar? Like where, hey, don't be open-minded or don't leave room for disagreement.
I mean, totally. Yeah. Well, and I would even say something similar to what you said is kind of funny as I was hearing you say that. I was like, oh, I would say similar things that I would be like, hey, you can disagree with me on this. It's totally fine. And I would say, I have plenty of friends who disagree with me.
Hmm.
I am fine being friends with people who are wrong.
Is that why you're friends with me?
That's why I'm friends with you.
Thank you.
That, um, yeah. So the idea that like somehow to approach something out of humility, that like I have convictions, but I also might be wrong on my convictions, to hold those two things together. I used to use language of like, I want to be a people who hold things tightly and loosely at the same time.
Mm,
That like tightly to me said that like I want, like, I'm not trying to not have conviction. Like I want to understand things well. I want to not use mystery as an excuse to not understand something, but mystery as a reason to endlessly understand something. Like I want to, and I want to have some like, okay, here's what I think about that. I want to hold that tightly, but I also want to hold it loosely at the exact same time. Like, here's what I've come, but I might be wrong. And there's plenty of people who would think that I'm wrong. And like that sort of a posture, I think it's hard to do. One of the things that's difficult, I do think, as like, this is like maybe a bit of a tangent here, but is something for the last several years that I've been processing quite a bit, because I always wish I could have stood up on stage and that there were things that I had convictions about that I knew would have gone against 98% of where our church was at. And I knew for me to share those things would be detrimental. And I used to always say, I wish we could have the kind of faith community where I could say to them, I know that you all are in a different place than me on this. And I have done my best to create space for you. And I want to ask you to do your best to create space for me. It's a really wonderful picture that I think doesn't take into account the power dynamics between a pastor and a congregation. And so I think that there are things within that that like make some of like what we wish would be true, in the kind of like room for multiple views, disagreement coming around the table with in all kinds of different places, that can make it difficult, unless a church has like maybe first figured out some sort of way to address those kinds of power dynamics, and to just even just acknowledge it and to create space for it, and to just be able to like put that out there and say that. Because even in what you're saying, like we're talking about folks having contempt towards us and experiencing condemnation as the pastor, but I think that like that experience then also caused me to turn it towards them
mm.
and to have some contempt towards them in the way that they were responding towards me, and that I had the right way that they should be responding, and they were responding in the wrong kind of way. And if I could
Oh,
just
interesting.
educate them,
Yeah.
that they would get to that right place, right? Um, so I love what you say of like, you're saying that like these are the kinds of communities that are beautiful, that like get rooted, and that there's like some like really beautiful growth happening right now, where like if that's being removed, not only in the people in the church but in those who are leading in the church, are not projecting that back in that direction, but are also saying like, I'm not lording this over you, I'm not looking at you as sort of less than in some sort of way. um I like, I want to receive from you in the same way that I hope that you receive from me, that there's something within that that feels a bit like what he says about the golden rule, that it's like the respect of others that we want to receive, that we're, I don't know, how does that all feel?
I think it applies, obviously, like we're saying, to the pastor, the member dynamic, but I think it's even more universal than that. I think if you approach theology with there is a right answer to every theological idea, I think that produces contempt, because
Sure.
then
Yeah.
whenever someone says, "Well, I see it this way," you almost have this knee jerk reaction of, "Well, you're wrong," or "You're stupid," or, in extreme cases, you're evil, you're choosing this, you right. And I think that's what's at the heart of why I just so resonated with what he was talking about with contempt here. I'm like, this is this is deep in the waters of evangelicalism, at least in my experiences, in 40 years of this, right? Of there is a right idea, there is a wrong idea to everything, right? And I would say there are some topics we should not be discussing with nuance as if all views are okay. For example, I don't really want to argue someone who says, "No, I think sexually abusing children is valid. Let's talk about the merits of that." Right? Like, no, it's not. And so there are things I go, I don't want to debate this from multiple vantage points. Like, I think we can universally acknowledge that's wrong, that's evil, and we can move on from that, right? But to say that everything is in that kind of a category, I think is a huge uh, error of thinking. And I think this is where, when I pop in and out of all sorts of different spiritual communities these days. So sometimes I'm in more progressive communities, sometimes I'm in more conservative communities. And that is a tension when I'm in the more conservative evangelical spaces, is oftentimes there is this assumption, well, of course you believe this way on this thing. And I have found, like you were saying, as a pastor, I can sometimes get frustrated with people's reaction. And my wife said something to me one time that I thought was so good. I was getting frustrated with someone who, I don't remember what the subject was, but I was like, I'm laying out this argument so well, so logically, so compellingly. Why are they not getting it? And my wife looked at me and she goes, "Jeremy, how long did it take you to change your mind on that?" And I was like, "Oh gosh, this was years and da 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 da." And she goes, "Maybe it'll take them more than one conversation." And it was like, "Oh yeah, that's really good. Like, that's really good." And so I think that's where I can have contempt for people of like, how do
Yeah.
you not see what I have seen, And I have to approach it with compassion, especially if a lot of times I have believed what they are believing at one point in my life. So I know what it feels like to hold that belief. And, we could talk about some specifics of that, but I then try to go more of like a missionary of how do I empathetically reach out to them, acknowledging there are valid reasons why they believe what they believe, but then trying to lovingly show them, hey, maybe there's another way to view this. But at the end of the day, being okay with, even if they never agree with me, that we can still exist in this community together. And I don't care if, I think you said something like this on your time with me on my podcast, but I don't care if you're conservative or progressive. It's more about how open are you to people and to, creating space. Like, that to me matters more. And I think that's what kills contempt, is when we are open and our hands are ready to receive differences. When we close it off and we say, no, this is the right way, I have it, you don't. I just think that culture breeds contempt.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so like I feel like some of what you're saying, he starts to move into he makes a statement when he talks about the giving not giving pearls to pigs.
Mhm.
That I found really like helpful and meaningful, that he says, we're always to respect other people as spiritual beings who are responsible before God alone for the course they choose to take of their own free will. And so he talks about the idea that the way that he reads the not giving pearls to pigs teaching is that the point is that the person who's being given the pearl isn't being helped because they can't ingest the pearls. The pigs can't ingest the pearls. And so it's not a that there are some people who are less than, or some people who aren't worthy to receive a thing, or whatever, but it's just that like the thing that you're giving them actually isn't helping them, regardless of how good your intentions are, regardless of how great your advice is, that it's actually not helpful for them. And that we approach it out of this posture of like, well, I respect you and your own personhood, respect other people as spiritual beings who are responsible for God alone for the course that they're going to choose to take of their own free will, which takes this like huge burden off of your shoulders to like, oh, so in some spaces that I had been in previously, that it was like I have to fix all these people who are living in these kinds of ways, and in spaces I'm in now, it's I've got to fix these people who are in these spaces I used to be in, who right? Like I've got to go there in order to convince them to see things in this kind of a way. And I think one of the things I was telling somebody recently that like they're asking me if I were to go back into church ministry, like what would I do differently as a pastor? And there's several things, but one of them is I don't think I actually treated people like adults.
Mm.
I think like a lot of the time, the way that I had learned to do ministry and had experienced it and had like the framework that had been built for me and that I then perpetuated was not uh creating the space for people's own sort of like personhood and autonomy and to be full adults who are making their own choices as adults to like and that you can put things out there. It's more of like I want to create a kind of soil that people can be a part of and grow in if they want to, and if they don't want to, I don't have to compel them to be a part of it. And I don't think I did a great like I tried to move people into spaces, convince people of things, try to almost like push people towards certain kinds of things rather than just respecting them as adults who are going to figure out their own thing.
I think as I look back, like what would I do different? I think I got so passionate about some of these ideas and, to to defend myself, it was in the best of intentions. Um and I think, similar to what you're saying, I think I would probably go, I don't think these things matter quite as much as I want to believe they matter, that hey, this is the way to view this. And um I don't know though. I just think, I tried to lead a mainstream evangelical church to become more open, and ultimately don't think that I was able to do much of that for the majority of the community. Obviously there were people that loved that and resonated with it, but um, that's where I think there's something in the water in most churches, and you can kind of sniff of, is there one answer to everything here, or is this a community where we respect one another and we actually like it when we disagree, and we like it when we have nuances. And there are days, we walk out of the sermon, we go, wow, I've never heard that perspective before, I'm gonna have to go process it. And there's other churches like, that was a great way to say the right answer to that question. And maybe it's personality too. Maybe there are some people that are just wired, they need that certainty in order to function. And I think there are people like you and I that we I think thrive on a bit of intellectual chaos, and some of that openness. And maybe there's some personality there that, is unrealistic to expect of others too. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely, I think you and I have probably talked before about like stages of faith theory has become really important and helpful for me. And one of the things I found myself doing some like stages of faith theory was really came about and thinking about an individual's own like sort of path of maturity is uh um for folks on the podcast who aren't familiar, a guy named James Fowler, behavioral psychologist, wrote about this in the 1970s first with a book called Stages of Faith, where he looked across multiple faith traditions asking, are there consistent ways that I can see that people are moving towards what would be experienced as maturity in their faith? And he found that there were, and he was able to sort of like categorize it in the way a behavioral psychologist would, and puts out this theory that then several folks have built off of that. The book that I read in seminary is called Critical Journey, that took that and built off of it. But then Richard Rohr's done work on this, talking about two halves of life, which really are well, what book is that? Do you remember what book that is where he
Falling
talks about
upward,
that?
is that where you talk?
Falling Upward. Yeah. He builds on that. McLaren does it with his work on stage. I don't remember what his is called now too. Faith After Doubt, maybe something like that.
Sounds right.
Um, he talks about stages of faith within that. So they're all building out of Fowler's work. And one of the things that was helpful for me to realize was this isn't just an individual thing. It's also like thinking about it corporately within the church. And I've gotten to go into churches and to like work with their teams to think about like, think of your church through this lens of here's these different stages and here's what people need at those stages. And some people really need certainty because that's where they're at.
Mhm.
And some people really need some black and white thinking and even like some us and them, and it's a earlier developmental stage just like it would be for children who are growing up and like learn in the same sort of way like we experience those same sort of stages. And the systems that we have set up in the church, though, will sometimes create a lid or a capacity uh, around people's ability to grow in those. So we create systems unintentionally a lot of times that perpetuate people being sort of like stuck at certain stages. So um, all that long thing to say, like, I think I put myself in a place now where I have more room for people to be in those places rather than like, why don't you think like me?
Hmm.
Because I think the right way.
Yeah.
Like, why don't you allow like, enjoy the intellectual honesty or the curiosity or the, like, expansiveness of this, or even thinking that, like, gosh, people have thought about this 12 different ways throughout church history, and we don't have to land on any one of those. All 12 of those can, like, somehow sit together and, like, makes this thing more beautiful because they all sit together. And, like, while that would be where I am, I think that one of my growth experiences in the past several years has been to create capacity for not everyone to need to be there.
Mm. That's maturity, Mike.
You know, every once in a while, you get a little spark of it.
Did you ever
Yeah.
read like the integral theory, which is very similar to what you're talking about?
Yeah, he gets into spiral dynamics.
Yeah, and then
Yes.
I'm trying to think of that guy his name, but like
Ken Wilber.
yeah, Wilbur, integral
Mhm.
Christianity and all that. It's definitely interesting to process through like different phases, but I I think the problem that I have in that, and he says, it's not like you've arrived at a better stage and you're better than everybody else. That thinking though creeps into my mind whenever I use that
It's hard not to.
paradigm. So it's almost like it's not helpful for me because I keep going back to like just keep moving through the stages. You know what I mean? Like, why are you stopping? And so I have to like, okay, like just this is where you're at. And I also just think there's part of I don't know if it's getting older or getting hurt in the church and just pain does this to you, but just being okay to say, yeah, there are people that see this all different ways and God bless you. Like don't need to convince you of anything else. And I'm talking with this guy right now. It's interesting. He had attended a church that I spoke at, and he's really close to someone there, and he's not really been connected with God. He's grown up in it, but so he's asking his friend who's in the church his advice on stuff, and then he'll ask me my take on it. And what he's realizing is that they're very different, of what I'm saying to him versus what this other guy is saying to him. And he's asked me about that, like, well, so and so said this, like, but you're saying this, and I just said, yeah, that's the way this works. Like he's telling you what most Christians would tell you right now. And I said, so if that makes sense to you, like go with it. I said, but that doesn't work for me and that doesn't make sense to me. And here's why. And if that works for you, like you can also view it that way. And I think I'm just getting more okay with those kind of conversations rather than having to go back and go, oh, I got to follow up with that guy and tell him, stop saying what you're saying. It's like, no,
Yes.
you can be there and you can say that. And, uh, but I can also offer something different.
Yeah, yeah, so you're offering something, and then you're respecting the agency of the other person
Right.
to, like, you're gonna make your own decisions. So, yeah, Willard wrote this, that I found really helpful. He said, "The most important element in the transformation," he's talking about, of personal relationships. "The most important element in this transformation is this: as long as I'm condemning my friends or relatives or pushing my pearls on them, I am their problem. They have to respond to me, and that usually leads to their judging me right back or biting me, as Jesus said.
Mhm.
But once I back away, maintaining a sensitive and non manipulative presence, I am no longer their problem. As I listen, they do not have to protect themselves from me and they begin to open up. I may quickly begin to appear to them as a possible ally and resource." That, like, that post, like, it's such wisdom here, I think, from him, of like that posture of not making people feel like they are constantly on the defensive with you, no matter how right you think you like it. That sort of like change of posture, the non-manipulative presence, um really does have a transformative. sort of effect on relationships. And
Well, and
yeah,
there's no contempt in that. There's no condemnation in that. That's him practicing what he preaches, right? And he has this idea that I think is, again, it's like a no duh, but you're also like, this is so good. It says to understand Jesus' teachings, we must realize that deep in our orientations of our spirit, we cannot have one posture toward God and a different one toward other people. We are
right.
a whole being, and our true character pervades everything we do. And I just love, like, if you are treating people this way and then you're trying to worship God in this other way, and oftentimes that's what Christians are known for. Like, there's a huge disconnect from the way you are with your God and then the way you treat people. And we're just like, it's the same, like, you are the same person, and I just love that phrase. You are a whole being.
Hmm.
You you cannot parse out, well, yeah, this is how I am with God, but then this is how I am toward this person because this person's an idiot. Like, no.
Yeah. Well, and if I remember right, I think like he talks about that in his Ask Seek Not, where he's getting through the Ask Seek Knock section, or it's right around there, where he's talking about asking, seeking, and
I don't
knocking
remember because the chapter is long.
is long. But in the Ask, Seek, Knock section, he says this is first about the way we relate to others before it's how we
Right,
relate
right,
to
right, yep.
God. And which I remember the first time I read that, that being this like, that was another one of those like really helpful shifts for me of like, oh, that there's this kind of way of relating to others where he says, like, you ask them for what you want, and in doing that, you're giving them agency, and then you're respecting their agency. You respect what their answer is. And if you can do that with people, then you can also do that. And this is where he starts to move into prayer a bit. You can also do that with God, that you can ask and you respect God's agency to do what God is going to do. And that asking always is non manipulative. And as soon as we ask in a way where we're trying to manipulate the outcome, it's not actually asking, it's manipulation.
Mhm. That was a nice transition there to get us to prayer. You ever thought about doing this for a living?
Oh, you know what? If podcasting made me money and didn't cost me money,
Uh.
um, okay, so he talks about prayer and yeah, I'm just curious. Well, let's first of all, we talked about this a little bit now at the beginning, like 35 minutes ago. That we talked about prayer and we talked about seeing hints of some potential like open theism and what he's writing there. Like for folks who aren't familiar with what open theism is, why don't we start there? Like, how do you give like what's your like high level short overview of what open theism is?
Well, I have had one person tell me what open theism is, and they said that's where you don't take the Bible literally. And I was like, no, you might want to try that again. That's has nothing to do with open theism. Open theism is the idea that God can exist and know some things as reality and some things as possibility. So open theism makes room where God can interact with creation in real time and doesn't have to necessarily know everything to every nth degree. And the way I always kind of get into the conversation with someone is I say, does God know the exact route you're going to take tonight when you drive home, the exact second you're going to leave, this place, and the exact second you're going to get home? And the typical Christian will be like, well, absolutely, God knows everything. And then, an open theist would say, no, God doesn't know that. Now, God can know all the possibilities, every single possibility of what route you could take, when you could leave, when you could arrive. And God can foresee all the possibilities, but God doesn't know which possibility is going to be reality until that possibility happens, right? So you don't catch God off guard in the sense of, holy cow, I never anticipated that could ever happen, right? This is still an infinite God that can go, yeah, no, I thought that would happen. But it makes room, truthfully, for a whole bunch of scripture that is very interesting with the typical way we think of God that doesn't fit. And Willard gets into it in this section. And I was stoked because when I read this, I didn't know what open theism was.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that open theism opens up some room for is the ability for God to change God's mind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is some of like the scripture that you'd be alluding to. Like the I first got introduced to open theism in my very first theology class as an undergrad with Steve Richardson.
I remember
and
that.
he took us to Genesis or Exodus 32, I think it is. Moses is up on the mountain. God says, "I'm going to kill all the Israelites." Moses says, "Please don't kill them all." And God says, "All right, I won't kill them all." Seemingly changing God's own mind there. And so in a classical theistic view that like you were describing, the classical theistic view would say, well, God never intended to kill them. And so maybe God was like, we'd come up with all these conjectures. Maybe God was asking that thing of Moses in order to get Moses to plead with him in order so that they could have this interaction or whatever it is. But an open theist would say, well, that feels like God is just sort of like lying in order to manipulate. What if, like, what's actually happening there is that God intends to kill all the Israelites? And Moses is pleading with God. And this is where it moves into what he talks about with prayer here. Moses is pleading with God actually changes God's mind and changes the outcome. And that Moses is able to, through this conversation with God, through Moses's asking, is ordered to have a different kind of outcome than what would have been there.
And the way Willard says it is God's response to our prayers is not a charade. He does not pretend that he is answering our prayer when he is only doing what he was going to do anyway. Our requests really do make a difference in what God does or does not do. That is straight open theism, like 101, right? And so, what's funny, if you talk to a lot of Christians and you just ask the question, what's the point of prayer? I'm amazed how often people will say, prayer doesn't change God, prayer changes us. Perhaps your listeners have heard this, right? Prayer doesn't change God, prayer changes us. Which I go, yeah, prayer changes us. I had no problem with that. However, you have problem with a number of scriptural stories if you're going to make an argument that prayer doesn't change God, because you brought up one, right? And then Willard brings up, he says the second Old Testament scene involves one of the really good kings in Judea, Hezekiah. The story of Hezekiah is the one that made me like, I went on a journey because of this one story in the Old Testament. And just real quick summary of Hezekiah. He's the king. Isaiah is the prophet. Isaiah is told by God to come in, give Hezekiah the king a message. He tells him, put your affairs in order. You're about to die. Literally says, you will not recover. That's part of the message. You will not recover. Isaiah walks out having delivered God's message. Hezekiah falls down, pleads with God, has this like brutally honest moment of prayer, like, I don't want to die. I'm not ready to die. Da, 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 da. God sees this reaction and God goes, oh, okay. Taps Isaiah back on the shoulder before he's even gone out. He hasn't made it to the parking lot yet. Isaiah goes back in and says, oh, God heard you, saw what you just did. He's decided to give you 15 more years to live. That story to me was the like nail in the coffin of the traditional view of God's foreknowledge, where I was like, okay, so again, some people would say, well, God knew he was going to give Hezekiah 15 more years. That's why God did that. And I would say that is the most manipulative portrayal of God, then, that does not look anything like Jesus to me, of a God who is just constantly saying things and doing things that aren't real, but making you believe they're real so that God can force you to do something a certain way. And I love that Willard brings this story up. Like, this is amazing. And fun fact, I almost didn't get ordained, Mike, because of this story. When I was in ordination right out of college, and we were going through all these things, and they asked me about the foreknowledge of God. Now, again, I went through all of my undergrad not knowing what open theism was. So evidently I wasn't paying attention that day. We went to the same school, so I'm not sure. We had the same professors. Not sure how I missed it, but I missed it. Never heard about open theism, okay? So I come back and I'm like wrestling in real time with the story of Hezekiah. And I remember we get to my ordination. I get a 3 team of elders that are meeting with me, talking about my theology to make sure I'm good. And we get to something about God's foreknowledge. And I'm like, yeah, I think God can change his mind. You know, they're like, why? I'm like, well, the story of Hezekiah, all this. And one of the elders was like, I don't think Jeremy's ready. Like, literally, this was like the moment. And we had to talk through it. And I had to like present my ideas about Hezekiah to the elder board of like, no, this is why, you know, and And again, I didn't even know open theism was an option yet. I just knew I think God actually responds to what we say, and there's some textual evidence here. And I don't know. I think I don't, Willard's not known for being an open theist, but these are some open theist arguments he's making
Yeah.
here.
Um, well, so first, what's funny is I almost didn't get ordained because of open theism as well,
Really?
and had to do a second follow-up interview with our elders around that as well. Um,
Are we the same person?
which is kind of funny. And I don't know I don't know if I would fall as strongly squarely in the open theism camp as you do, but I have a lot of openness to open theism.
See what you did there.
Um, but here's what this this small section here on prayer, he spends a lot of time on prayer, but this particular section here, the part that we're talking about here, I think for me was actually the most impactful part of my reread on this chapter. And here's one of my experiences is that for folks who are going through some sort of like faith reorientation or evolution, one of the things that there's a couple of things that folks have a hard time putting back together. The first I've noticed has been like an engagement with the scriptures. And I think a lot of folks have figured out ways of re-engaging the scriptures that they can feel comfortable with, and they re-engage it, whether it's through some critical theory or some post-critical kinds of reading of the text, or there's a few other ways I've seen folks like be able to feel more comfortable re-engaging in the text. But prayer is the thing that I think my experience is most people still feel uncomfortable with and haven't fully put something back together.
Hmm.
And like some of my own journey was I moved towards much more what would be called apophatic prayer, which is where instead of talking, we're listening. And I needed that. Like I needed that as a helpful correction to the kind of prayer, like what my experience of prayer had been. And so it was like a lot of contemplative practices around receiving and listening, and had been so transformative and helpful for me. It had been really, really meaningful. And I remember I was talking to a spiritual director a couple years ago about this, and I was like, "Gosh, all of my prayer the last several years has been apophatic prayer, and I pray a lot, but it's all around listening." And that hadn't been a part of my practice before. Now it's 100% of my practice. And this guy who I just like really respected, he was like, "You're missing something really significant in a relationship with God if you're missing out on what would then be called capophatic prayer, which is the talking part of it." And he says, like, "I think that you need to figure out some ways to reintroduce that." We started trying to work through like, what does that look like? And one of the things that Willard says in this section is that he goes, "Start by praying for what you're genuinely interested in." That he says people have thought that they should pray for wonderful but remote needs that they have little or no interest in or even knowledge of. And like that was just this hopeful like re-engagement for me in small ways, in a kind of engagement with God that didn't look like just receiving and listening, but also like this space for asking, and in non-manipulative ways, that just simply starting with like, what am I genuinely interested in? What do I desire? And starting with that, and that I've been being transformed through my contemplative experiences in a way where like even those desires are transformed in ways.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, like I found just this little section to be just a really helpful encouragement of re-engaging in that aspect of prayer for me at least.
I like how he like simplifies it, right? Like just pray what you're actually thinking about. And he acknowledges like, yeah, those things may change over time where they become more of
Yep.
things of God, but like you don't start there. And if you like prayer for me has always been a challenge because I'll theologically correct myself in like mid prayer. Like I'll say something, to God, and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. God doesn't work like that. You know what I mean? And then I'm like, in my head theologically trying to break down like what am I asking God to do here, or like, you know what I mean, I'm like, is that the way God works? Can God even do that? Like, and I can get so in my head. And so I prayer has been one of those things. You talk about people deconstructing, it has been a journey for me to put these pieces back together to figure out what does a healthy process look like. Because if I were to say, my journey, certainly the last 10 years, has been realizing that I think Jesus is as good as I suspect he might be. And like actually believing that, where I'd be like, wow, it'd be really cool if Jesus was like this. And then I'm like, no, I'm going to believe that. If I can even envision that Jesus could be something, like I'm going to believe that. Like Jesus isn't less than what I could imagine him to be. And so that's part of like, one of the things I get stuck on, and I'm curious if you've ever had this issue. Willard says, always we are simply children walking and talking with our father at hand. Right. I love the image of just a child and dad or mom or whatever.
A healthy dad or mom.
A
Yeah.
healthy relationship. Right. That's great. But here's where I get stuck. Not to throw a curveball out to the audience, but this is just where in real time I'm processing through. I think about, okay, I have 5 kids. So as a dad, I can relate with both ends of this. I'm a son. I'm also a dad of 5. If my kid, any one of them, was drowning in the water, if we go to the ocean and one of them is drowning, there is not a chance that I would wait for them to ask to be saved in order for me to step in and save my child. So there's no sense of like, well, it'd be coercive of me to save them if they haven't asked for it, or. So there's an element of this that I think it's almost like we don't think God is going to do something good if we don't ask God for it, that I struggle with, because I'm like, I think God's better than that. And I don't think God is a lesser parent to us than I am to my own kids. So if I know how I would be with my kids, God has to exceed that. I do not think I'm a better parent than God would be. So if I know that I would step in, I would intervene, I would act for the good, right? I would never wait for my child to ask me. And just the thought of saying, okay, a dad watched his child die, and then the parents or the police afterward interview him and say, why didn't you step in? Well, he never asked me to. I mean, that's like a ludicrous idea, right? And yeah, that's often how we describe prayer. We're like, well, you didn't ask God for it. And that's what I'm like, I'm working through that because I'm going, no, if God is as good as I think God is, and God looks like Jesus, I think God is always working for my good, whether I ask God to do that or not. So then I get into like theological nuances to that, but this is where I just get lost in my own head. You have this issue, or you beyond that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely I thought you were gonna go in a different place at first of the like God not stopping bad things from happening in general,
That
like
is
right.
another. I've been talking with Thomas J. Ord on that. That is another
Yeah.
whole fascinating road.
Yeah, we'll have our friend Tom Ord on here at some point, and Tom's book that he's probably most known for is called God Can't. And Tom is an open theist, open and relational theist, and he would say that there are actually things that God is incapable of doing because God's driving characteristic is love, and because of that, love allows for free will, and that there are then capacities that have been that like God is incapable of breaking. Which is fascinating, and I think a really interesting conversation, and really interesting to bring into the conversation around prayer. That like I think like I don't have mechanical answers for how prayer makes sense to me yet, because I do think that there is something that does not that feels like if there are things that are there's good that God wants to do that is simply being withheld because somebody hasn't asked it, or asked it in the right kind of way, it puts all of the power in the person,
Mhm.
and it makes God a God who has capacity for good, who then withholds that good.
Correct.
Um, so I don't, yeah, I think Willard, I don't know what Willard would say on this, but he does seem to be alluding to that there are things that God wants to do uh, in you, through you, for you, but God is waiting for you to ask for those things because
Mhm.
God is non-coercive, and God is going to respect you and is a respecter of persons, and is going to wait for you to ask. Um, but I wonder if even within the idea that there is a multitude of possibilities, that God holds this multitude of possibilities there. And it's like, gosh, I'm not going to tell Jeremy which one of these to do. Um, but when Jeremy says, this is the one that I want, I'm going to like want to help in that direction in the way of like you're talking about with your kids. My oldest is in college now, and he's been like rethinking his major, and he's been like processing through that and been super proud of how he's done all of that. And we have been a resource to him. I have strong opinions about what I think he should do, but like I know he needs to make that decision for himself. And whether he makes the decision that I want him to make or the decision that like he's going to come to conclusions on his own as he processes through it. And then I'm going to throw my full weight behind how do I help him in that, right? And I wonder if like some of it in some ways looks a little bit like that of like, gosh, Isaac, there's a multitude of possibilities. What do you want? And I'll help you. But you got to pick what you want so like so I can help you with that thing.
Yeah, I definitely like that way of understanding it much better, because that's a very open theist. God asking, "Hey, which road do you want to walk down?" I like that idea. I just struggle with well, God didn't do that because you didn't ask.
Yeah.
I'm like, does not look like Jesus to me.
Yeah, I think that you're right there. In a yeah. I mean, it opens up one of the things that is difficult that I keep coming back to that I want to believe to be true that Willard sets out at the beginning is the idea that like God is the most joyful being in the universe. That God in God's abundance is constantly like creating that the universe is a perfectly safe place to be. Is creating that kind of place. And I want to believe that to be true. And I think Aaron Niequist was who was talking about this a little bit on the podcast with us here of the like, but it's also like you look at realities of things and it's hard to sometimes believe that that is true.
Hmm.
That there's something about believing that that's true that allows me to live in the kind of like safety and comfort to be able to live in the goodness of an abundant God. And then there's also reality that seems to conflict with that at times. And I don't know what to do with that.
I also loved, you made me think of this when he talks about laughter, and he kind of threw that into there. But at first glance, it kind of like stood out to me. I'm like, what? That seemed like out of nowhere. But then I think it actually fits what you're describing there. He says laughter is the automatic human response to incongruity, and incongruity is never lacking on the human scene, no matter how far advanced we may be into the kingdom. It is indelibly imprinted in our finitude. Like this focus on laughter as a response as he's talking about prayer and as he's talking about, this golden rule and all, like to put laughter in the midst of that and then tie it to the human connection, the human condition, I thought was so cool. And it reminded me something that Rob Bell recently said. I had a chance to have him on our podcast, and I asked him a question because if anybody has followed Rob Bell, like he went from being the darling of evangelicalism, every pastor wanted to be him, to public enemy number one. This guy's a heretic. And you would think like that's a lot of church hurt. Like that's a lot of pain to go through. And yet, if you listen to him or watch him now, he's always laughing, like always laughing. And I just asked him that question, like, how do you laugh with all that you've been through and all the pain? And then you're dealing with heavy stuff. Like, how do you laugh? And here's what he said to me on the podcast. He said, I came from a world, you and I did too, Mike, where you just keep moving, just keep producing, just keep working, just keep hoping. And some ways for decades now, I'm learning how to be present to the sadness and disappointment and loss and pain. And then he says this, and it sounds almost like what Willard is saying. There's an absurdity at the heart of the human experience. Absurdity is the door in, because if you're still trying to get it to make sense, you're in trouble. And I literally was like, that is different wording, but the same exact idea that Willard is saying. Laughter is the automatic response to incongruity, right? Like there are these things, and this is where I think if prayer comes out of that, it's very healthy. It's very raw. It's very real. It's not going to be formulaic at all. And yet, I don't know how much we've captured that. And then to wrap that idea up, Willard says something that I thought was such a great way to say it. He says, talking about Jesus, he was a master of humor and often used it to drive home the truths he imparted, as any good speaker does. But few today would put him, Jesus, on their guest list for a party if it were really going to be a party. Just as we don't think of Jesus as intelligent, so we don't think of him as pleasant company, someone to enjoy being around. Is it any wonder that someone would rather not be his student? Like, here's this brilliant thinker, Dallas Willard, making it so incredibly real and tangible. And I just loved this whole section.
It's good. Jeremy, what a gift to have you be on here. What a gift to you gave up your time to engage in this chapter. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Where can the good folks find you out? Where can they find the work that you're putting out? Where can they pay attention to you?
So jernigan.com is my website where all the things I'm connected in, they all land there somewhere. So I do podcast links, Cabernet and Pray, but you can find all that through that website or just wherever you listen to podcasts. And on my website, post weekly blogs, and when I'm speaking somewhere, I usually try to post those videos as well.
Wonderful. Well, dude, what a gift. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
This was fun.